IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. Sri Lanka is facing its worst ever economic crisis. Inflation is at record levels, goods are scarce and expensive, there is no fuel available, and recently the country defaulted on its international debt. This has resulted in social and political turmoil, bringing out people onto the streets to protest against the political leadership. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa had to resign and escape Colombo, and a new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has been sworn in. He warned the country of tough times ahead. I think that's a bit of an understatement, but we'll know more about it soon. What has brought Sri Lanka, once a model economy in the region, to the present past? To discuss this, we have with us Sasanka Perera, who teaches sociology at the South Asian University in New Delhi and has written extensively on the country. Himself a Sri Lankan, he has also written books on photography, art, and social anthropology, apart from translating novels into Sinhala. Welcome to the Wire Talk, Sasanka Perera.
Thank you.
To begin with, are you surprised at what has happened in Sri Lanka and at such speed? It was always hailed as a strong economy. Now to see it defaulting and on its debt has come as a shock.
Well, it's not that much of a shock if people were seriously watching the situation. We knew 2 years ago this was likely to happen, unless some remedial action was taken at that time. But then Sri Lanka is not really has not been a model democracy for the last few years. It has been a family business. So the problem is when a country becomes a family business, when it is run by a group of brothers, as in our case, and extended relatives. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. The Rajapakshas are everywhere in the Sri Lankan political system. Then the checks and balances that are generally expected to be in place in a functioning democracy no longer functions. So the problem is that even though this was seen 2 3 years ago that this is likely to happen, either their advisors never informed them or they were not in the game of accepting advice. I mean, you have to remember our president has 250 or so advisors with paid by public funds. But then the problem is these are also advisors or people with fairly dubious backgrounds. So you don't see the kinds of people who can actually advise a regime like this in place. So the short answer to your question is it was not surprising.
But surely, along with this level of crony or rather family capitalism, so to speak, there must have been some structural reasons that were also happening along with it. So, what was it that they were also then ignoring that this was emerging?
Yeah, there are lots of things. I mean, like the rest of the world and South Asia in general, the pandemic obviously did not help. But the pandemic cannot be blamed singularly for this because other countries have come out of it. Bangladesh and India are among those. I mean, not fully come out of it, but nothing like Sri Lanka. But there were other reasons that are not necessarily directly linked to these people's way of governance. For example, a couple of years ago, this what is known as the Easter bombings took place in Colombo when a number of Christian churches were bombed by a group of local radicalized Muslims, and that also hit the tourism industry fairly severely. Pandemic and Easter bombings ensured that tourist arrivals in Sri Lanka really dwindled. Most of whom are, by the way, coming from India. But but the other issues have been much more longer lasting, and that is why I think that is why I am saying that these things were not unknown; they were actually known. For example, we have been borrowing heavily from the international markets as well as private bankers and countries for a very long time. And while this was being done, there has been no serious attempts at institutionalizing or establishing a local, fairly strong local economy. So Sri Lanka's there is no real industrial sector to talk of. So when something happens globally under these kinds of conditions, then obviously the country will feel it much more seriously than a country that has much more seriously established economic foundation. And the second was that even though money was borrowed, you also have to see what kind of projects they have been invested in. So I'll give you three examples, which are classic in explaining the situation. One is the so-called Rajapaksa International Airport in a place called Mattala in southern Sri Lanka in Hambantota, which happens to be the president's hometown. And that is now known as the world's emptiest airport because no one comes there, right? Then we have a harbor built in the same city. It's again, which is a very expensive project, which has now been handed over to a Chinese state-owned company for 99-year lease because the Sri Lankans couldn't run it. Both came from Chinese loans. Now, the third is there's something called the Lotus Tower in Colombo. This huge tower, which is supposed to be South Asia's tallest standing structure, looking over the Colombo's landscape, which is supposed to be a shopping hub with art galleries and restaurants and all these, the kinds of things that Sri Lankan popular imagination holds as signs of development and being posh. Now that remains empty too. So now imagine the kinds of money that have been put into these things, all loans, all Chinese loans. And if you also look at the expressways in Sri Lanka, which are they look good. I mean they look very nice. But the secret is again they've been built with Chinese funds. And if you look at the per kilometer expenditure on these roads, they happen to be among the world's most expensive roads. So now put these things together, you have a situation where there are these kinds of so-called investments for which there was no need to begin with, and it's also very difficult to pay back. On top of the fact that other money that has been borrowed have not properly invested with a plan to pay back or with a plan to recreate Sri Lanka's economic foundation. Now, none of this has been done. So, obviously, this is a recipe for disaster. It's just a matter of time. And I think now the time has come.
While you were saying this, I mean, I have regularly visited it over the past few years for quite some time, though not in the last 5 years, I must confess. And one follows what's happening in Sri Lanka. My understanding is that till a few years ago, all these things must have been known now in the last 3 to 5 years, especially among economy watchers or the intelligentsia or even lay people. But a few years ago, the Rajpaksas were flying high. So that means that they were taking advantage of this groundswell of favorable opinion and then investing in these vanity projects with no plan in mind.
Yeah, true. That is exactly what happened because, see, these guys were not. I wouldn't call them dictators in the conventional sense that they didn't grab power through a military coup. They were elected to parliament with a popular vote, not just once, over and over many times. Rajapakshas have held government twice before, President Mahinda Rajapaksa and now his brother. So you're right. So these, particularly the present president, was brought in with such a massive margin of the popular vote for one thing, and that is to usher a certain kinds of prosperity for Sri Lanka ensuring there is no favoritism, ensuring that there will be a technocratic government, so that to make sure that this is a clean kind of regime as opposed to the kinds of favoritism laden governments that we've had in the past. But this has not happened. So what has happened is a continuation of the same thing, but maybe, not maybe, but surely the kinds of people who have been appointed are far more unenlightened. I think you have to look at only our foreign service to think of this. Now, 70% or more of Sri Lanka's foreign service constitutes of political appointees. So that is a very serious problem. Some years ago, I asked someone, what is the percentage in India? So these colleagues kept on telling me there's almost no one. I mean, I'm talking about ambassadors who are sent, and people below them. So now, just imagine, in a crisis situation, you have to depend on these people to deal with foreign leaders. Now, our people that have been appointed cannot do this. And it's not just at the top; it is also, below this ambassadorial kind of level. Now, that is the foreign service. You also look at the civil service, which the kind of interference that goes on to most of the public bodies like corporations and these kinds of entities, including to secretarial positions of ministries, we see complete outsiders being appointed who are not from the civil service, who don't have the background, don't have the training, don't have access to that networks, and now they are mostly military people, ex-military people. So there is this militarization of the Sri Lankan administration too, below the president and the prime minister, below the political structure, in the so-called regular civil service. So when it comes to a matter of crisis management, I think it has become impossible because the people who are in positions of power, by and large, simply cannot do that. They don't have the training. They don't have the background.
So, what you've spelt out is mismanagement of funds which come at an expensive price from the international market, the Chinese debt. Of course, the Chinese debt has got its own brand of sinister villainy, but we'll just call it international funds. Then cronyism, putting all your family members as well as, as you said, unqualified people in the steel frame of civil service as well as foreign service. So, really, it's jobs for the boys in some sense. And a little bit of a lot of money being moved out from the system. So, leakages. Now, when do you think that the love affair of the populace, which had elected them with such hopes, when do you think it began to go sour?
See, I think it has been going on for a while. I would say at least for the last, at least almost from the beginning of the appointment of the president, simply because of one main thing, and that is the actions, the rhetoric of efficiency and clean politics that he promised did not really come up from the beginning of his regime. And one of the things, classic examples, happen to be these appointments that I was talking about. For example, to Maldives, they sent a singer, a popular singer, and just, I mean, who couldn't even speak English. So I mean, that's just very strange. So that was something that was very clear. And second is also the kinds of people who were appointed to the to as certain institutions, agencies of the government. Now, for example, the aviation authority of Sri Lanka, the one who was appointed was the president's former travel agent from Los Angeles. Now, of course, he knows something about flying, but come on, this. See, what it did was that the claims of clean management, that kind of thing disappeared very quickly. And so that was, I would say, almost from the beginning. But more clearly, this has been going on, the dipping of popularity since late last year, when things were becoming very difficult in the street, with regard to things like petrol becoming, not just petrol, but cooking gas and fuel becoming unavailable. Now, it's much worse than the last time I was in Colombo. Now, for example, my own car doesn't have any fuel. And so, I mean, this is just an individual who's somewhat privileged, you know. Now, what about those people who are not? So I think the thing that really hit hard was when essential services became unavailable. Essential services and essential goods, including milk powder. Rice prices have gone up. And another thing I forgot to mention was the disastrous decision by the president, I think in 2019, to ban the importation of chemical fertilizer in the name of creating an environment for clean agriculture, organic agriculture. Now, nobody in their right mind obviously will oppose this, but you can't do this overnight. You know, including the JVP, the Janata Vimukti Peramuna, the Marxist little party that is in the opposition. Now, this was also in their agenda, but they were proposing something like, let's do this over the next 30 years, which is more rational. So, what has now happened is that agricultural productivity in the country, not just rice, but tea and rubber and everything that brings foreign exchange, have also diminished overnight.
From what I understand, that bit came from advice from India, not officially, but
That part I don't know. But even let's say it came from India for the sake of argument, but why would you want to buy that? As a supposedly independent country, you also have to look at your own context, isn't it? Now, I think I would also support organic agriculture, but I would also suggest that you have to take your context into account. You can't do this overnight. And what has happened now? This kind of thing has happened before in the I would say 60s and 70s under British government advice. Reforestation was happening in the hill country, where suddenly we people were growing. I mean, when I say people, the government was growing in these pristine hills pine and eucalyptus, and it was, you know, it's completely ridiculous thing to do. They look beautiful when you go up there. Now you may have seen this, but the point is draining our water, the water body from the ground, because this is what these are not natural trees. There were natural trees that could have been grown. So this is not the first time that some decision like this has been made. But this is the singular most important reason why local agricultural products are in short supply and also very expensive, even if you don't have to import them.
how much have social policies which precede the Rajpaksas but they may have added fuel, uh, like, growing majoritarianism and going after the minorities. This, I've been reading about how the Buddhist clergy, for example, is asserting itself and almost, if not directing policy, but certainly influencing it. How much of that has played into this?
See, I don't think that kind of politics have necessarily played a role in the current economic crisis. But it has certainly played a role in the long term in making Sri Lanka a kind of a diminishing democracy. I would say a dismantling democracy, because this is not the kind of history that we inherited at the time of independence, which is why that Lee Kuan Yew, in his biography, says that Singapore should emulate Ceylon, just coming out of colonialism. But then that story has changed. And part of the problem is that, let's say that economic crisis didn't occur. for the sake of argument. But then the relationships between ethnic and religious groups are far from ideal, and that is not a good foundation for any country to progress. So we might argue that for the sake of it, the kinds of issues that led to the interethnic conflict between the Sinhalas and the Tamils and the civil war, which the civil war ended in 2009, but not necessarily the problems between these two groups. That is so that issue is no longer felt in the south, but not necessarily in the north. But what has come to capture the attention of people in more recent times is the other kind of disintegrating relationships between the Sinhalese Buddhists and the Muslims, and and these are not necessarily things that have happened as a result of any natural progression of things, to put it mildly. These have happened, including the 1983 riots directed at Tamil civilians, as a matter of engineering. I mean, these were like 1984 in the case of Delhi. So these were not accidents that happened as a result of some. There were proximate reasons, but they were all engineered. So, but I mean, there are a lot of reasons for this because the state and also the majority people, in from which, fortunately, unfortunately, I also come from, have invested a lot of time and effort to control minorities. Look at our textbooks in schools; they generally narrate a singular story. A story of Sinhala history. So the minorities are completely diminished, whether they are Christians or Hindus or Muslims or Tamils or whatever. And also the kind of popular histories that are talked about in popular programs on television has a very Sinhala-centric tone to it. And on top of that, you also have a school system which is ethnically segregated. So if you are Sinhala, you will go to a Sinhala school, as I did throughout my life, right up to university. And therefore, there is a good chance that you will never meet someone who speaks in Tamil. I might have met a few because of my family connections, but otherwise, most people would not. So imagine the segregation and the kind of situation it creates. You are creating a kind of an exclusivist mind frame from the beginning, right? Now, put to this equation the Buddhist clergy. Now, this is the clergy's involvement in Sri Lankan politics is from about the 1930s. There were a group of monks that H.L. Seneviratna, the anthropologist in University of Virginia, calls political monks. This famous monk Valpola Rahula, who wrote this book called What the Buddha Taught, is one of those earliest monks. But these were generally people who came from a kind of a Marxist background, but they were not into ethnic politics. They were into politics of a different kind. They were into politics of social reform. They were in politics of a kind of a nationalism and so on. But now you have a group of monks who are actually promoting two things. One is violence against minorities, or even in the Sinhala society, people who oppose them. And other kind of thing that they promote is a certain very specific kind of Sinhala Buddhist state, which is not what independence was all about. It almost sounds like a kind of a theocracy, except that none of these things, interestingly enough, can be explained or justified on the basis of Buddhist ethics themselves. But that is what most people seem to be unaware of.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Are you looking for finance products and services that can enhance your personal finance experience? Are you looking for a space to talk about your financial product or service? And are you looking for a crisp talk show where the conversation is all about money? Well, your search ends here. Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta and I'm host of the Paisa Vaisa podcast, and I invite you for the conversation about your personal finance on each Monday on the IVM Podcast app or the website or on any podcast streaming platforms. See you folks.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. So much of what you said, Sasanka, is quite familiar to us sitting in India at the moment. But before I touch upon that, do you think that the economic crisis of Sri Lanka, while adjusting for several absolutely local factors, including the fact that it's a smaller country, but it's the kind of thing that could spread to other South Asian countries or, in fact, to other developing countries, which is what now people are beginning to say of, not being able to manage debt and then get carried away by all that loose change that is in your pocket. Do you think that what are the economic lessons that other countries could learn?
See, in the case of South Asia, I would say Pakistan is already in that kind of phase. I think looking at what the Nepal central bank is doing, like restricting imports and so on and so forth, they are also somewhat in that kind of situation. So at least these are at least two countries which probably haven't faced the Sri Lankan situation as such, but they seem to be going in that direction. And I think that the way to look at it is this. Now, it seems to me that India is, well, if this happens to India, I mean, I think consequences would be much more serious. Even though right now the sound coming from most people is that India might face this, but might not collapse as soon as or as spectacularly like Sri Lanka. So one hopes this is correct. But this is also no longer just a South Asian problem. I think this is becoming a global problem. I read somewhere recently that about 70 countries around the world, this is a likelihood that this kind of crisis might reach them. But to me, the issue is this: it is not just a matter of whether this is a global issue or not, but what does it mean to us in the region? Now, even if India stays afloat and Sri Lanka goes down, I mean, there's no other way for it to go right now. The repercussions, I don't think we have really talked about this in any kind of forum. Now, already you know that there were few people who were apprehended by the Indian Coast Guard crossing over from Lanka to southern India to Tamil Nadu. And when I was last in Colombo, I actually interviewed a group of Tamil speaking people who had already sold their lands in northern Sri Lanka to collect money to go to Tamil Nadu. Now, this is just one case. Now, imagine this situation gets worse. We have a history of running to India whenever something happens. And just as much as until the 1970s, there was a history of a kind of an Indian migration, unchecked migration to Lanka too. And now that stopped in the 70s after the conditions in India itself improved. But my concern now is that the kind of exodus from Sri Lanka to India that you experienced in the time of the civil war can easily happen again. Now, if it does, it is not only going to be people from the northeast, these Tamil speaking people, it might also be the Sinhalese, because this is a crisis that is engulfing the whole country. So, to me, while this is a global problem, I think we have to really seriously look at how to deal with it in our own backyard. And I don't think people are paying adequate attention so far.
And even though one can now take this into another direction and go on ad nauseum about it, but it's important to know and ask, what do you think Sri Lanka's majoritarianism and the kind of, as you said, Buddhist monks calling for against minorities, that is something that we are also seeing in the region of privileging one community or one religion, religious group, or one language over another. What do you think, irrespective of the economy, what do you think could be the consequences of something like that?
See, to me, that is much more dangerous in terms of consequences than the economic crisis itself. Because let's say in 2 days, somehow with some miracle, some people are expecting such a miracle from the present prime minister that he will somehow create this solution from some sort of magic. Let's say it's somehow resolved, then you have still this majoritarian issue to deal with, because that is not something politicians have seriously spent time on, right? And that is the main thing so far until this economic crisis struck Sri Lanka. That has been the most negative consequence of Sri Lankan politics, and that has to be dealt with. But I mean, the examples I gave you, these are structural issues about how history is seen, how schools are organized, how textbooks are written, and how news is broadcast, and so on and so forth. These are structural issues that need to be addressed by the state as well as by the citizens, right? Now, that people have not paid serious attention again. Now, I would say that one redeeming factor in the ongoing protest is that you can see, particularly in the protest site, main protest site in Colombo, that some of these issues seem to be resolving itself at least at the level of the public, at least at the level of, I would say, discourse, political discourse of protest. I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, Muslims have been demonized for the last 10 years in Sri Lanka by the Buddhist majority. But now, in this main protest site in Colombo called Golface, which people have renamed Gota Go Gama, which literally means get lost Gota Bay village. I mean, they formally named it. Even if you Google it, you'll get it. So now in this space, you see Buddhist worship, the Buddha Jayanti, the Buddha Purnima was held just few days ago, for which I could see Christian clergy taking part, relatively unheard of in our context. Earlier, when Eid was celebrated, it was publicly done in this place with Sinhalese and Buddhists and everybody else taking part. So, in other words, the kind of divisions that existed, very deep divisions, seem to have been erased, at least for the moment, at the level of public discourse and in the context of protest. You also see this in some significant rituals. For example, 18th of May is the day that the government marks the what is called the Victory Day. That's the day that the Civil War officially ended in 2009. So generally, you see this by what the military do, the kinds of parades and all these kinds of things. But that is also the day that the Tamils in the Northeast celebrated, not celebrated, commemorated their dead, because in the last stages of the war in Mullavaikal, the some of the calculations say that 40 to 70,000 people died because of the way that war was fought towards the end. And the present president is one of the key characters in that war. But that was something that the Tamil commemorations were only in the Northeast, particularly in the North, and that was constantly being targeted and harassed by the state. So it was very difficult for people to do it. But this time, soon after, on the 18th, just as much as Buddha Purnima was celebrated by all these people other than Buddhists, the Tamil commemoration was also celebrated by Sinhalese as well in this particular site, while the president and his political colleagues were still celebrating the victory sign. So I find these things very hopeful. But at the same time, these are deep rooted problems. They can't be resolved simply because of this kind of situation has erased these deep cleavages for the moment. I think you have to work on it. Now, working on it will not come from the state. It will also not come from the mainstream political parties, because it is not in their interest. Because what is in their interest is to make sure that there are divisions, because those divisions can be used for electoral politics. So now, whether the citizenry are adequately motivated or adequately organized to make sure that these things are resolved remains to be seen. But I am a kind of an eternal skeptic, so I'm not really sure. But I also prefer to be hopeful.
So, finally, in short, can Sri Lanka get itself out of this sinkhole, economic, and will it do it?
Well, my worst nightmare is a single realization, and that is that Sri Lanka does not really have political choices. Now, if this is going to be resolved by the motley crew that are currently in parliament, then we are beyond help. It doesn't matter whether it's the opposition or this government. Now, the new prime minister, who has been prime minister about 5 times before and never completed his term any time, has appointed a new cabinet, but it's the same people. So now, same people who are implicated in all kinds of things. Now, how the same group of people can deliver Sri Lanka out of this mess is anybody's guess. So, current parliament, I don't think can do this. It is just not conceivable. Now, calling for an election right now is an expensive affair for a country that is completely bankrupt. And even if somehow you do it, who will be elected? Because it will be the same political formations that are going to be contesting. Now, if people are serious about having what they call a system change, then first you have to change the electoral rules. And second, there have to be a way to pressurize political parties to exile the kinds of culprits that they have in their party ranks. Now, I don't see any of these things happening in the short term. So, the only answer I can give is that I don't see any deliverance from this in the short term, and by that I mean the next 2-3 years.
So, basically, it opens the door for international agencies to come and perhaps give their advice, which means perhaps more pain in the coming years. And a population already suffering will have to bear even worse. These things have happened in countries across the world. So I suppose Sri Lanka will also have to uh, bear its share of poor Sri Lankans will have to bear their share of the hardships that will be imposed on them. So, Sasanka, for our listeners, you have really explained so well what the situation in Sri Lanka is. More importantly, how it got here. For that, we thank you. I think there is a tremendous goodwill for Sri Lanka in this country, individually and otherwise. So we can only hope and wish it the best. But we'll keep looking at what's going on. Meanwhile, once again, thank you so much for helping us understand this crisis, which is on the front pages of all the newspapers.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thanks for having me.
That was Sasanka Perera, who teaches at the South Asian University in Delhi, and he's a Sri Lankan, and he explained to us what exactly is happening in his country and why it reached where it has. We'll be back once again next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey. Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Dr. Vishaka tells Ashton how it's possible to reverse chronic disease with lifestyle changes. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam meets Sushil Agarwal. He's the founder and director at Ethika Insurance Broking. They talk about the importance of choosing the right health insurance policy. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth talks about comfort zones and how they hinder our growth. On Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka shares 7 super hit tips to manage your finances. And on Hans Vani, here's the story Shaheed. It explores whether the respect for a martyr can change based on his caste. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has launched merchandise and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab and check out the first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media as well. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, wherever you do that, that is really helpful for us. And do remember, you can also check a lot of our shows out on YouTube. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, you get a list of all of our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey, so please do help us out with that. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/survey, it'll help us understand a little bit more about our listeners. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, and Capgemini. Get the future you want. Thank you so much. Without you guys, this wouldn't be possible.